The alarm didn't scream. It just buzzed, soft and insistent, the kind of sound that somehow feels louder than any scream when your soul is already wide awake at 5:47 in the morning. Marcus sat on the edge of the bed, elbows digging into his thighs, both hands cradling his head like it was a fragile thing that might shatter if he let go. His wife's breathing came steady and slow from the other side of the bed, the soft rise and fall of someone who trusted him to figure things out. His daughter's door was closed down the hall, and behind it slept a 7-year-old who still believed her daddy could fix anything. Marcus closed his eyes and felt the weight of that belief pressing down on his shoulders like a physical thing. The unfinished project at work that was already 2 weeks past deadline. The stack of bills on the kitchen counter that he'd been flipping face down so he wouldn't have to look at the red numbers. The conversation he kept postponing with his boss, with his wife, with himself. Every single one of them felt like a locked door, and he was standing in the hallway of his own life with empty pockets where the keys should have been. He'd prayed. Oh, he'd prayed. Night after night, lying in this same bed, staring at the ceiling while his wife slept, he'd sent up words that felt like they were bouncing off plaster and falling right back down on his chest. Where are you? What am I supposed to do? Why aren't you answering? The silence that came back was the loudest thing he'd ever heard. It wasn't the peaceful silence of a chapel or the quiet of a retreat center. It was the hollow silence of a phone call that never comes, a door that never opens, a voice that seems to have forgotten your name. He thought about his father, who had worked the same job for 40 years and never seemed to wrestle with the kind of doubts that were currently eating Marcus alive. Was that generation just built different, or did they hide it better? His dad never talked about feeling lost or overwhelmed or terrified that one wrong move would send the whole house of cards tumbling down. Maybe he felt it and just never said it. Maybe that was the problem with the way Marcus was raised. You learn to carry things silently, to put on the brave face, to be the rock. But rocks don't feel. Rocks don't crack. And Marcus was cracking. The clock in the hallway kept ticking. 5:52 now. In about 40 minutes his daughter would wake up and come padding down the hall in her unicorn pajamas, and he would have to be dad. He would have to pour the cereal and pack the lunch and ask about the spelling test and pretend that the world wasn't slowly collapsing around his ears. His wife would look at him across the kitchen with those eyes that knew him too well, and he would have to decide whether to tell her the truth or keep protecting her from the weight he was carrying. She had her own burdens. Her own fears. How could he add his to the pile? This was the moment. The in-between moment. The space between darkness and light, between despair and something he couldn't quite name yet. The whole house was silent except for the ticking clock and the distant hum of the refrigerator, and Marcus felt completely, utterly alone in a way that had nothing to do with the sleeping family around him. It was the loneliness of a man who had convinced himself that he was supposed to have all the answers, and the moment he admitted he didn't, everything would fall apart. And then, without warning, without any conscious effort to summon it, a memory surfaced. It came not as a fully formed thought but as a sensation first. The smell of coffee brewing in a kitchen from 30 years ago. The feel of a vinyl tablecloth under his small elbows. And a voice. His mother's voice, soft and certain, reading aloud from a worn-out Bible with pages so thin they crinkled when she turned them. She used to read the same passage so often that Marcus could hear it now, word for word, even though he hadn't opened a Bible himself in months. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your paths straight. Proverbs chapter 3. Verses 5 and 6. His mother's favorite. She had underlined it in that old Bible so many times the ink had bled through to the other side of the page. She used to say it was her anchor verse, the one she held onto when life didn't make sense. Marcus remembered asking her once, when he was maybe 9 or 10, what it actually meant to lean not on your own understanding. She had smiled and ruffled his hair and said something so simple that he'd forgotten it until this very moment. It means you stop trying to be God, baby. You let him be God, and you just be his child. Marcus sat there in the dark, the words washing over him like water on a wound he didn't even know was still open. He wasn't healed. The bills were still on the counter. The project was still behind. The fear was still there, coiled in his chest like a living thing. But something had shifted. Just a fraction. Just enough to let a sliver of light into a room that had been sealed shut for months. He didn't understand why God had been silent. He didn't understand why the prayers felt unanswered or why the path ahead looked so impossibly steep. But his mother's voice was still echoing in his mind, and for the first time in a long time, Marcus wondered if maybe understanding wasn't the point. Maybe the point was trust. Maybe the point was letting go of the need to have the whole map and just taking the next step, even if the next step was just getting off this bed and facing the day. The sky outside was turning from gray to pale gold now. The first birds were starting their tentative morning songs. In a few minutes the house would come alive with the sounds of his family waking up, and Marcus would have to decide what kind of man he was going to be today. Marcus didn't get off the bed right away. The memory of his mother's voice had stirred something, sure, but stirring and changing are two completely different animals, and Marcus knew the difference intimately. He'd been stirred before. He'd had moments of clarity in the middle of sleepless nights, moments where everything seemed to make sense for about 90 seconds, and then the morning came with its relentless demands and those moments evaporated like mist on a hot sidewalk. So no, he wasn't going to be that guy who suddenly has an epiphany at 6 a.m. and then pretends everything is fixed. That's not how real life works. That's not how faith works either, if he was being honest, and he was too tired not to be honest. The question that kept circling back, the one that Proverbs 3 verses 5 to 6 had unlocked but not answered, was painfully simple. What does it actually mean to trust God with all your heart when everything around you looks like evidence that trusting anything is a fool's game? His mother's words were beautiful. Let God be God. Stop trying to control everything. He could still see her face. The way her eyes had flickered, not with anger, but with something worse. Hurt mixed with a kind of weary familiarity, like she'd been expecting it. Like she'd learned to brace herself for the sharp edges of his stress. He had said something about how she didn't understand the pressure he was under, how she couldn't possibly know what it felt like to carry the entire financial weight of a family while his career felt like it was built on quicksand. The words had come out fast and hot, and the moment they left his mouth he wanted to pull them back, but words don't work that way. They land. They burrow. They become part of the history between two people whether you want them to or not. And the truth, the ugly truth he didn't want to look at directly, was that his anger at Angela wasn't really about Angela at all. It was about the job offer he'd turned down 6 months ago. The one that would have meant more money but also more risk, a startup with no guarantees, a leap into unknown territory. He had prayed about it. At least, he had gone through the motions of prayer. He had sat in his car in the parking lot after the final interview, staring at the steering wheel, and he had said the words, "God, show me what to do." But when the offer came, he let fear make the decision. He told himself it was wisdom. He told himself he was being prudent, responsible, protecting his family from unnecessary risk. But deep down, in the place where self-deception doesn't work, he knew the truth. He hadn't trusted God enough to take the leap. He had trusted his own calculations. His own spreadsheets. His own desperate need to feel like he was in control of something, anything, in a world that felt increasingly uncontrollable. And now here he was, 6 months later, watching the safe path crumble beneath his feet while the risky path he'd rejected haunted him like a ghost of what might have been. The irony settled into his bones as he opened the spreadsheet from August, the one with both projections still laid out side by side. His cursor hovered over the column he'd labeled safe, the numbers now bleeding red. Beside it, the path marked risk still glowed with the quiet taunt of what could have been. He closed the laptop before the screen could blur. Proverbs said not to lean on your own understanding, but he'd mistaken his fear for wisdom, his caution for faithfulness. The coffee had gone cold. Outside, rain streaked the window. He pressed his palms flat against the desk and let the weight sit there, heavy and still, until the silence in the room felt less like accusation and more like an invitation to finally listen. G on foolishness, it warned against leaning on his very best thinking, his most meticulous analysis, his most reasonable, well-researched fears. All of it. He had built contingency plans like a man stacking sandbags before a flood, certain he was being prudent, only to look up and find himself already drowning. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Not with the sliver of heart left over after anxiety had done its work. Not with half a heart while the other half stayed up late, pacing the floor of his mind, rehearsing every worst-case scenario. The truth landed different now, not as a sermon point, but as a mirror. His self-protection had been its own quiet disaster, and he was only just beginning to see it. T isn't terrified. All of it. The terrified parts too. Especially those. Marcus had been lying to himself about his trust in God for years, and the lie was so subtle he hadn't even recognized it as a lie. He believed God existed. He believed God was powerful. He believed God could intervene in human affairs. What he didn't believe, and this was the nice sharp truth that cut through everything else, was that God cared about the small details of his particular life. The big stuff, sure. Salvation, eternity, cosmic purposes. God could handle those. But the day-to-day stuff? The project deadlines and the mortgage payments and the tense conversations with his wife? That felt too small, too mundane, too unworthy of divine attention. And so Marcus had unconsciously divided his life into two categories: the spiritual stuff he gave to God, and the practical stuff he handled himself. It was a functional atheism dressed up in Christian language, and it had been killing him slowly for years. The sky outside was fully gold now, the kind of gold that only happens in the first hour after sunrise, when the light is still soft and forgiving. A car door slammed somewhere in the neighborhood. Someone's dog started barking. The world was waking up, indifferent to the internal earthquake happening in a middle-aged man sitting on the edge of a bed in a house that felt, in that moment, like both a sanctuary and a prison. Marcus finally stood up. His joints protested. He was 43 years old but felt about 70, the cumulative weight of months of poor sleep and constant tension having aged him prematurely. He walked to the kitchen, poured the cold coffee from yesterday into a mug, and put it in the microwave. While it heated, he stared at the stack of bills on the counter. They hadn't magically disappeared. God hadn't sent an angel to pay them. The problems were still problems. But something about the way he looked at them felt different, even if he couldn't articulate what the difference was. He took the coffee and stepped out onto the back porch. The morning air was cool against his face, carrying the smell of cut grass from somewhere down the block. And that's when he saw him. A man walking a dog on the sidewalk that ran behind their property line. The man walking the dog was just a neighbor. Nothing special about him. Gray sweatpants, a faded college hoodie, a golden retriever pulling at the leash. But something about the ordinariness of the moment, the stranger going about his morning routine, completely unaware that he was being watched by a man on the edge of either a breakdown or a breakthrough, something about that ordinariness cracked something open in Marcus. Because here's the thing about moments of surrender. We always imagine they'll happen in church. We picture stained glass and altar calls and organ music swelling in the background. We think there's a proper setting for giving up control, a sacred space with candles and kneeling benches and someone in a robe saying all the right words. But Marcus discovered what every honest believer eventually learns: surrender doesn't need a sanctuary. It just needs a moment when you're too tired to keep pretending you're in charge. And that's when Marcus did something he had never done in 43 years of calling himself a Christian. He didn't just pray. He surrendered. Then he did it. Right there in the parking lot. He shifted in his seat, turned toward the passenger side because somehow that felt less ridiculous, and he got on his knees. In the car. A 43-year-old man in dress pants and a button-down shirt, kneeling on the floor mat of a sedan that still had a coffee stain from 3 weeks ago, with his forehead pressed against the cool leather of the passenger seat. And he prayed. But not the kind of prayer he'd been praying for years. God, I don't know which way to go anymore. His voice cracked. He didn't care. I've tried every door I can see. I've analyzed every option. I've made spreadsheets and pros and cons lists and 5-year projections, and I'm still standing in the same place, more lost than when I started. The words came faster now, tumbling over each other like they'd been waiting in a long line for permission to exist. I surrender. Not just this decision. Not just this job situation. All of it. Every plan I've made. Every backup plan behind the backup plan. Every fear I've been nursing like it was my job to worry. Every relationship I've tried to manage instead of trust you with. Every bill I've stared at like the numbers were going to change if I looked hard enough. He took a breath. It felt like the first real breath he'd taken in months. Every dream I thought you gave me that now feels dead. Every door that slammed shut and every door that opened and every door I'm too scared to walk through. I'm giving it all back to you. Not because I'm holy. Not because I've finally figured out how to trust you properly. But because I can't carry it anymore. I literally cannot. My back is breaking under the weight of trying to be my own savior. The tears came then. He didn't fight them. Give me wisdom, Lord. Not the wisdom the world gives. Not the kind that comes from fear dressed up as prudence. Your wisdom. The kind that can tell the difference between a door you've opened and a door I'm trying to kick down in my own strength. The kind that knows when to move and when to wait. The kind that doesn't need to understand everything before taking the next step. He pressed his forehead harder against the seat, as if physical pressure could somehow translate the intensity of what was happening in his soul. And give me peace. Not the peace that comes when everything works out. Not the peace that's just relief after a crisis passes. Your peace. The kind that doesn't make sense. The kind that stands in the middle of a storm and doesn't flinch. The kind that guards my heart and my mind when every circumstance is screaming that I should be terrified. Something shifted in that moment. Not in his circumstances, the problems were still problems, the decisions still needed to be made, the bill still sat on the kitchen counter. But something shifted inside Marcus. A transfer of weight. A relocation of burden from shoulders that were never designed to carry it to the only one whose shoulders are broad enough. He stayed there for a long time. Kneeling in his car. Breathing prayers that had no structure, no eloquence, no theological precision. Just the raw, unpolished honesty of a man who had finally stopped trying to impress God with his competence and started trusting Him with his brokenness. When he finally sat up, his knees ached and his eyes were red and his shirt was wrinkled in ways that would have bothered him on any other day. But he felt lighter. Not because anything had changed, but because everything had changed. The circumstances were identical to what they'd been an hour ago. But the man facing them was not. Here's what Marcus learned that morning in the parking lot, and here's what I want you to hear today, dear friend, especially if you're standing at your own crossroads, paralyzed by fear of making the wrong choice. Fear does not get to make your decisions anymore. Fear has been running the show for too long. Fear has been sitting in the driver's seat of your life, gripping the wheel with white knuckles, and every destination it's taking you to has been a dead end of anxiety and exhaustion. Fear is a terrible navigator. All fear keeps whispering that same tired lie it told you in that hospital waiting room 3 years ago, that God is secretly stingy with His goodness, that His provision has a limit and you're about to hit it. It's the voice that made you forget how He carried Marcus through the chemo treatments when the doctors had run out of options. That same fear wants you to erase every single miracle you've already held in your hands. But God isn't asking you to map out the entire journey right now. He's asking you to trust Him with the very next step, just one step, the one right in front of you. He doesn't promise the road will be smooth. He doesn't promise you won't face setbacks or wake up in the middle of the night wondering if you misheard His voice. But He does promise this, and this is the solid ground we're standing on. He will be with you on every road. Every single one. the paved highways and the bumpy dirt paths, the scenic routes and the dark valleys, the roads that make sense and the roads that seem to lead nowhere. He is present on all of them. He is faithful in all of them. He is still working in all of them.